Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about A Power Unbound by Freya Marske. And for some reason, I put off writing this review for like 3 days and then put off recording it for like 3 more days. Why? I don't know! But I can say I really liked this book, and now it's time for me to make my thoughts march in a nice little line that makes sense. So A Power Unbound is the book 3 of the last Binding trilogy, so there will be spoilers for book 1 and 2, A Marvelous Light and A Restless Truth. Normal warnings apply that if you do not want to read those books and have bits of it spoiled, now is the time to stop this video, go read those books, come back, and we can talk then. But the important thing is this video will still be here for you whenever you want to view it. But this book starts with Jack, also known as Lord Hawthorne, now fully committed to helping Violet, Maud, Edwin, and Robin in their quest to collect the pieces of the last contract before they can be used by the magical government to pool all of Britain's magic into the hands of the power-hungry magicians that have been hunting for these items for the last 2 books. Men have been trying to break into Spinnet, the magical house that Violet inherited from her eccentric aunt, where they suspect the knife, the last of the 3 items, is hidden. Too bad Jack and the others have no idea where in the house it's hidden. Spinnet House is a magical and musical puzzle box, which was an allegory I was so proud of myself for thinking of, and then I looked on the back and realized that no, the author also described it that way, so I'm doing great. But the important thing is, luckily, a key comes knocking on their door. Alan Rossi. Alan is what Edwin describes as a perturbator. He perturbs things. Someone who magic sort of slides off of. He's also a thief, a journalist, and a man clinging desperately to a life just above destitution. And despite his natural hatred of the entirety of the aristocracy, he cannot help but be drawn to the equally angry, emotionally damaged Jack, who has never gotten over the loss of his sister and his magic 16 years before. Can they get past their wildly uneven social, economic, political, and magic power dynamics to become a safe port in the storm for each other? Can this messy alliance of the weakly magical, the anti-magical, the not magical, and one solid magician do anything to stop the machinations of powerful men seeking more power? Read the book to find out! And yeah, as suspected, this book is 100% carrying on the themes started in the previous 2 books about power and powerlessness. I was a little surprised to see exactly how baldly it leaned into the, let's say, the governmental side of this. Like, this magic government is sliding downhill at top speed towards fascism. Our heroes and the book itself make it very clear that it almost doesn't matter why the Assembly wants the ability to pool all magic in Britain to one magician to use. The mere act of one person having that much power is itself a problem. And of course, the people seeking it are bullies, entitled assholes, and the power hungry. In the previous 2 books, there is a tone that the assumption is that the, government will be seeking the consent of the people whose power they will be stealing, or at least, if not seeking the consent in the moment that they're planning on stealing the power, like, having consent to do this as a general rule when necessary. But this book makes it very clear that these men assume they have the consent, or just don't care that they don't have it. It shows that the pooling of power is inherently a stealing of power from the many for the few. And how they excuse doing this horrible thing is first by making up a nebulous threat that the darkness is coming. Which I admit, in the first 2 books, I did interpret as like, oh, there is actually a looming threat on the horizon. But slowly throughout the series, especially in this one, it becomes significantly more clear that no, there is no looming threat. It's just they are saying this so that they have a reason to steal more power. And yeah, that's often the first step to establishing a fascist government. Then there's a moment when the conspirators start using our heroes, who are all outsiders in one way or another, as their excuse. No spoilers here, not going to talk about specifics, but a couple of big confrontations happen that are public, and one of them ends up pretty destructive. And so, of course, the conspirators paint it in such a way that it makes it sound and look like our heroes are the power-hungry ones, grasping for power that they do not have the rights to. And this is an excuse that sounds exceptionally plausible to a lot of people because Edwin is a magician with incredibly weak power, and Jack has actively lost his magic. And it's easy to imagine them as jealous and entitled to magic that they lack. But of course, from the inside, from the reader's perspective, it's very clear that they both have significantly more complicated relationships with magic than that. Like, yes, they both definitely wish less for the magic itself as for their lack not to cause them to be outsiders in their own society. So of course we as readers know that they're not the kind of men to grasp for this power. And yeah, that blaming of the powerless, the assumption that those without power would be just as cruel and violent in their desire for power as the people actually in power are cruel to the powerless. And even the assumption that someone definitely wants power, all of that is part of building up an enemy for a government to fight back against. And then using that as an excuse to pull power into the government, yeah, that's just fascism. That is what fascism is built on. And so, yeah, it is a pretty bald fascist government here. And so we have that power dynamic going on between the government and the people, but we add on the layer that all of our main characters, Edwin, Jack, Robin, Maud, all of these people that the series has trained us to see as in one way or another powerless, are then set in contrast to Alan, a man who was not born with any of the privileges that they were. He has no magic, he has no money, he has no title, he has a charity education, he has people relying on him, his family were immigrants. The only privileges he was born with were being male and being pretty as hell. And he is the most aware of all of this. And I really loved that. I loved that we're seeing his rage at the power that is held over him, that was taken from him, that he has had to learn to live without. And it's a very real and visceral contrast to the people who we've seen as powerless, but are actually, they do each have their own very sincere types of power. And the entire book is very clearly making the point that it's easy not to see your own privilege, but damn easy to spot the privilege of those who are born with more than you are. And of course, the major theme of power is carried over into the romance element, and I sort of really loved the way it plays out between Alan and Jack. And it's partially because so much of it is play. This is a romance that is heavily built around the two characters navigating where the line is between role-playing power dynamics and actual power dynamics. And yeah, from the very beginning, part of Alan's anger at Jack stems from the fact that he can't help but seem to like the fact that Jack has so much more power over him. Jack is taller, physically stronger, from the highest echelons of society, wealthy, and in many ways his boss. Like, about half of the time, Alan is actively working for Jack, and Alan sort of likes it. He likes the fact that he can strike out verbally at Jack, and Jack will just return fire. That he knows he's not going to harm him with his words at any point. Jack is a safe person for him to fight back against. But also because he comes to trust that Jack would never actually use his real power over him, it's a safe power dynamic. So we end up with this book where the fantasy plot is all about a dangerous, abusive system that has a power imbalance over the people, and the romance plot is about a safe, consensual, enjoyable power imbalance. But I do also want to talk about other things other than the themes of power, even though this book is so heavily about it that it's almost hard not to talk about it. But let's talk a bit about the characters and their trauma. So the thing that I loved most about this series from book one has been the characters. And never have I met two characters who I enjoyed more reading about, all the while knowing that I would hate them if I met them in real life. They are both catty ass bitches. They are both so angry. And I love them both. Mainly because they do both deeply care. Like, Jack tries his best to come across as disinterested, dissolute, and callous. But all the while, he's fighting hard for good. And we find out throughout the book more of the fights he's been doing this entire time. But also, I talked in my review of A Restless Truth about how all these main characters have their own brand of trauma built around being othered in a society that is not kind to outsiders. And of course, this continues here, but Jack and Alan also share a through line of their trauma being built around mourning. Jack is literally mourning his sister and the power that he lost roughly 16 years ago, and most of his emotional arc is about him finally facing that mourning, stopping pushing everything away and everyone away, and letting himself actively heal. Whereas Alan's mourning is more a subtle thing. It's never directly said, but it's so clear that he has spent most of his life mourning the possibilities of who he could have been. If his family had had just a bit more money, if he hadn't lost his father so young, if he had just lived in a society where there were a few more open doors for the poor, and then finally, if he had been a magician. And for him and for Jack to meet as equals, he has to accept that those losses the same way that Jack had to accept the loss of his sister and his power. Magic power. God bless, I can't stop saying power. And then that shared concept of mourning also plays into the way the last contract plays out in this series. And there's so many lovely things going on with mourning throughout the book. But also there's some lovely stuff in here about sin eating, used as a metaphor for taking on the responsibility for others, martyring yourself for the sake of loved ones, and the need to let someone else shoulder part of that burden, which is also absolutely lovely. I do think where Freya Marske shines as an author is in the emotional complexities of her characters and how these emotional complexities play out throughout the stories. But in contrast, I do feel like the plotting is a little bit of a weaker spot in this book in particular. It's occasionally felt a bit shaky as to why sometimes the conspiracy was attacking our leads in covert violence, and other times it was through legal proceedings. I feel like it wasn't 100% clear how much they were doing this all with full governmental backing versus how much was the government turning a blind eye to this versus how much the government just didn't know about it. And that could have been a nice bit of added tension, like us wondering, oh, like, do they know? Do they know? If somebody says something, will that fix it? But instead, it just comes across as the book itself sort of not knowing. And part of that, because of that, stemming from that, we have the courtroom scene, which felt a little bit cringe. And once again, no spoilers here, but there's a scene where our heroes try to play their hand by being aggressively open and honest with what's happening in front of witnesses. And aggressive honesty, especially in situations where emotional honesty is usually tempered, sometimes does just feel cringe. But in this case, I feel like it was worse because as a reader, I was not sure what the stakes were. And it ends up being almost inconsequential. Like, if I had known how much the government knew, or even had a strong implication of how much the government knew, this deep honesty would have read very differently. And so it felt sort of like they were bearing their souls for nothing more than to remind the reader that these characters have learned to bear their souls. And that in itself felt a little bit cringe. And also the climax, it's a big action sequence that I mostly love, except for the fact that it's happening in front of an audience, And there were several moments that I, as a reader, was wondering why the audience wasn't doing anything. And there are a couple moments when, yes, people from the audience do briefly get involved in the action, and that just simply drew my attention to how little these other people who are deeply impacted by what's going on are actively involved in this thing. And like, they're just sort of standing there watching it and going, oh no! And I'm like, guys, I feel like somebody would do something. But other than that, I think this book did juggle a story that has a hell of a lot going on pretty damn well. This one was a bit more than the others, feeling like it has a romance plot and a fantasy plot that are thematically and emotionally linked to each other, but are two separate plots. Whereas the others felt a little bit more like they were one plot that just had two angles. But add in the fact that this one is showing us more of what the previous two couples are like from the outside, and that's a lot. And like, I did enjoy seeing the two couples from the outside. Like, I love getting to see Jack's thoughts on Edwin and on Robin and on Violet and on Maud, especially after having Edwin and Robin absent for most of book 2. I really appreciated seeing them again. It felt like, oh look, my found family has refound each other. And also just seeing the dynamics between all the different people. It's wonderful. And like, seeing how someone like Jack would see their very different dynamics was very illuminating. And one of my favorite scenes in this entire book was one where Jack and Edwin get to address their own past, and it's both a bit more closure, shows us the growth in both of these characters, and is giving us information to further the fantasy plot. And it was a beautifully turned scene. I do think also the character of Dufay suffers a little bit from the fact that there's so much going on in this book, because by the time we get to them, there just isn't really enough time to build this fascinating character. And like, Dufay is both incredibly important to the plot, but also, by necessity, a mere sketch of a character. And that did remind me of those two characters I mentioned in the previous review from A Restless Truth, that I was like, yeah, if they come back in book 3, that was the right amount of character development, but otherwise it feels a little bit like too much character development. And yeah, they don't come back. So yeah, that was a little bit too much character development. But Dufay is sort of the exact opposite in that, like, yeah, they do sort of need a bit more character development and they didn't quite get it. But I liked the ending of this one, both as the ending of a book and as the ending of a series. I don't have a perfect understanding of the entirety of the magic system. I have questions, and the Falling Action actually goes out of its way to introduce a couple more questions. But I felt like that was the right number of questions for the end of a series. It left enough open that I can give these characters and this world imaginary futures. I could sit here and write fanfiction if I wanted to. Not gonna, but I could. There's enough open that if Freya Marske decides to write more in this world, there are places for her to go with it. But it felt like a solid ending. Our characters got their happy endings. The fight is over, and the book made its points. Overall, I would say that I'm very happy with this one. Freya Marske is becoming another one of my new favorite authors. I just love the way she writes emotions. I love her prose, which I feel like I haven't talked much about her prose at all because it's my favorite kind of prose, which is mostly just clean, readable, disappearing into the background with the occasional phrase that is so lovely it stops you in your tracks and you just have to stop and hold a feeling in your mind for a moment before you continue on. But yeah, as long as you aren't a reader who prefers to avoid spicy romance, I would suggest the Last Binding trilogy. It's fun.